Born Marie Delphine McCarty, more commonly known as Madame LaLaurie, was a New Orleans Creole socialite and alleged serial killer, infamous for torturing and likely murdering her household slaves. Marie Delphine McCarty was born 1780, one of 5 children. Her father was Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, brought the family to New Orleans from Ireland around 1730, during the French colonial period. Her mother was Marie Jean Lovable, also known as the Widow Lecomte, whose marriage to Louis B. McCarty was her second. Both were prominent in the town's white Creole community. Delphine's cousin, Forgottenn de McCarty, was mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. On June 11, 1800, MLLE. Marie Delphine McCarty married Don Ramon de López, a high-ranking Spanish royal officer, at the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. In 1804, after the American acquisition, Don Ramon had been appointed to the position of Consul General for Spain in the territory of Orleans. Also, in 1804, Delphine and Ramon López traveled to Spain. Don Ramon López was recalled to Spain to take his place at court as befitting his new position, but that López never arrived in Madrid because he died en route, in Havana. During the voyage, Delphine gave birth to a daughter, named Marie. Delphine and her daughter returned to New Orleans afterwards. In June 1808, Delphine married Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator. At the time of the marriage, Blanc purchased a house at 409 Royal Street in New Orleans for the family, which became known later as the Villa Blanc. Delphine had 4 more children by Blanc, named Marie-Louise Pauline, Louise Marie-Laure, Marie-Louise Jean, and Jean-Pierre Paulin Blanc. Blanc died in 1816. Delphine married her third husband, physician Leonard Louis LaLaurie, who was much younger than she, on June 25, 1825. In 1831, she bought property at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name with little involvement of her husband, and in 1832 had built a 3-story mansion there, complete with attached slave quarters. She lived there with her third husband and 2 of her daughters, and maintained a central position in New Orleans society. The LaLauries maintained several black slaves in slave quarters, attached to the Royal Street mansion. LaLaurie's slaves were observed to be singularly haggard and wretched. However, in public appearances LaLaurie was seen to be generally polite to black people and solicitous of her slaves' health, and court records of the time showed that LaLaurie manumitted 2 of her own slaves, Jean Louis in 1819 and Devens in 1832. Subsequent to the visit of a local lawyer, one of LaLaurie's neighbors saw one of the LaLaurie's slaves, a 12-year-old girl named Leah, fall to her death from the roof of the Royal Street mansion while trying to avoid punishment from a whip-wielding Delphine LaLaurie. Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing Delphine to grab a whip and chase her. The body was subsequently buried on the mansion grounds. This incident led to an investigation of the LaLauries, in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 slaves. This, contrary to popular though, was a normal law in slave-holding states. Cruelty was illegal, and killing slaves was a crime. These 9 slaves were then bought back by the LaLauries through the intermediary of one of their relatives, and returned to the Royal Street residences. Rumors around this time reported stories that LaLaurie beat her daughters when they attempted to feed the slaves. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in the LaLaurie residence on Royal Street, starting in the kitchen. When the police and fire marshals got there, they found a 70-year-old woman, the cook, chained to the stove by her ankle. She later confessed to them that she had set the fire as a suicide attempt for fear of her punishment, being taken to the uppermost room, because she said that anyone who was taken there never came back. As reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11, 1834, bystanders responding to the fire attempted to enter the slave quarters to ensure that everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the LaLauries, the bystanders broke down the doors to the slave quarters and found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, who claimed to have been imprisoned there for some months. One of those who entered the premises was Judge Jean-François Canonge, who subsequently deposed to having found in the LaLaurie mansion, among others, a Negro wearing an iron collar and an old Negro woman who had received a very deep wound on her head who was too weak to be able to walk. Canonge claimed that when he questioned Madame LaLaurie's husband about the slaves, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. When the discovery of the tortured slaves became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the LaLaurie residence and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were called upon to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the Royal Street property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The tortured slaves were taken to a local jail, where they were available for public viewing. The New Orleans Bee reported that by April 12 up to 4,000 people had attended to view the tortured slaves to convince themselves of their sufferings. The New Orleans Advertiser wrote several weeks after the evacuation of LaLaurie's slave quarters, claimed that 2 of the slaves found in the LaLaurie mansion had died since their rescue, and added, "While digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and the condemned well having been uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found." LaLaurie fled New Orleans during the mob violence that followed the fire, taking a coach to the waterfront and traveling, by schooner, from there to Mobile, Alabama and then on to Paris. There are no reliable details of her death. Some say a boar hunting accident. No one really knows.